Okay, where we left off last is where we're talking about strategies to the federal government can use to get the economy out of a recession, or in other words, to close the GDP gap. And we have something called the Keynesian strategy, which was coined after an economist, John Maynard Keynes. Now, John Maynard Keynes, in the early part of the 20th century, said that the way out of the recession is to get someone to spend more on goods and services. And that will kick off a round of spending. For example, if I buy something from you, let's say I spend $10 on something that you made. Now, by giving you $10, what are you going to do with that money? Well, you're going to do one of two things. You're either going to save it or spend it. When you spend it, you are creating more demand, more activity, and each round that money is changing hands is creating another round of spending, another round of economic activity. And this is basically the reasons or the logic behind a fiscal stimulus. A fiscal stimulus is a tax cut or just more government spending intended to shift the AD curve to the right. So we have two strategic policy questions that we got to answer first. One, how much do we want to shift the AD curve to the right? And how do we do this? How do we induce the desired shift? Because we could shift it too little, or we could shift it too much. So let's go back to our example. If we have a GDP gap, again, sometimes called a recessionary gap, of $400 billion, do we shift the AD curve by an amount of $400 billion worth of output? Well, if we did that, we would call that the naive Keynesian model. Why do we say naive? Well, an increase in AD by $400 billion will not be enough to get us to full employment. And we say that it's naive because we're assuming that when we increase demand by 400 billion, that we're assuming prices will not change. If prices don't change, yes, we will increase output by 400 billion. But what if we increase spending by 400 billion and prices start to go up? That's going to eat away at some of that demand. An increase in AD by the amount of the GDP gap will be achieved only if aggregate supply curve is flat, which is another fancy way of saying prices are not changing. Shifting AD by the amount of the GDP gap will achieve full employment only if the price level doesn't rise, but it will, so that's why we call it naive. So now we have another term called AD shortfall. The AD shortfall, please do not mix up AD shortfall with GDP gap. The AD shortfall is simply the amount of additional aggregate demand needed to achieve full employment after allowing for price changes. In other words, after allowing for the fact that prices will go up and rising prices will eat away at some of that demand. So the AD shortfall is the fiscal target. So let's look at this. Now what we see here is this is where we are, point A, and this is the level of output, QE. But QE is not enough output to put everyone to work. We need to produce QF. So if we shift the AD curve by the amount of the GDP gap, GDP gap is this amount right here. If we shift it by that same amount, this amount is the same as this amount. We see that the new intersection, so from AD1 to AD2, the new intersection or equilibrium is going to be point C because that's where the two curves cross, the AD curve and the AS curve. But look where that leads us to. It leads us to an equilibrium level of output that's less than the full employment level of output. What we need to do is we need to take into account as the AD curve shifts, we start moving up the AS curve, which means prices are starting to go up. When prices go up, that eats away at some of that demand. So what we've got to do is we've got to shift the AD curve to AD3. We've got to shift it by this amount from here to here. Because when we shift AD1 to AD3, we get this new intersection with the AS curve. And that will give us equilibrium level of output that's equal to QF. So from A to E is the AD shortfall. So, increasing government spending is a form of fiscal stimulus, right? And what the thing is, you have to remember is once the government spends more money, that's not where the story ends. Every dollar of new government spending has a multiplied impact on aggregate demand. How much? Well, the total change in aggregate demand is going to be the initial injection by the government multiplied by something called the fiscal multiplier. So the impact of the stimulus on AD includes the new government spending, that's the stimulus, plus the subsequent increases in government's consumer spending and business spending triggered by additional government outlays. So the increase in overall demand is going to be the multiplier multiplied by the initial fiscal stimulus. It's going to look something like this. So here we've got the initial demand, AD1, and the government stimulates the economy. Let's say it buys some new goods and services and it shifts it to AD2. That's the initial change. But then that's going to kick off a multiplier effect, and that's going to cause other people to receive money to spend it, and other people to receive money and spend it, and ultimately the demand will eventually move to AD3. That's the total change in demand from B to A. Now, this is just a graphic that shows stimulus packages passed in 2009, I believe. And this was showing, for example, in China. China spent a lot of money. This is the amount of stimulus as a percentage of the overall economy on stimulating the economy, fiscal stimulus. Now, another way the government could stimulate the economy is cutting taxes. By lowering taxes, the government increases disposable income of the private sector. And when you have more income, you spend more. When you spend more, economic activity increases. So a tax cut directly increases the disposable income of consumers, and the amount of consumption increases depends upon the marginal propensity to consume, sometimes called the MPC. MPC. So the initial increase in consumption is going to be the MPC times the tax cut. So $1 of a tax cut is less stimulative than the $1 of government spending. Why is that? Well, think about this. If the government spends, so government spending equals $100 billion, that will shift the AD curve to the left by $100 billion. AD, 100 billion. But what if the government cuts taxes? Cut taxes. Well, that is not going to cause the AD curve. So if the government cuts taxes by 100 billion, that's not going to shift the AD curve by 100 billion. Why? Is because when consumers get that extra $100 from a tax cut, they're not going to spend all of it. They're going to save some of it. So what if a consumer has a marginal propensity to consume of 0.9, meaning for every dollar that they get, they spend 90 cents, which means aggregate demand is going to increase by $90, not $100, because they're going to save $10. So do you see, when the government spends money, it spends all of it, $100. When the government cuts taxes and gives more money to consumers, consumers will only spend a portion of it initially. That's why a tax cut is less stimulative than a government spending program. So an AD shortfall can be also closed with a tax cut, right? And so you can see the government cuts taxes, but some of it is spent and some of it is saved. So a tax cut may also be an effective mechanism to increasing investment spending. So we could try to induce the business sector to spend more too by cutting business taxes. Now, we're talking about the government stimulating the economy. They also can restrain the economy. If the government is worried about inflation and they want to cool the economy down, there are times when you want to shift the AD curve to the left, or at least stop it from shifting too far to the right. And we call that fiscal restraint. They could use tax increases, sometimes called tax hikes, or they could use spending cuts. The government could spend less on goods and services. So when it comes to stimulating the economy, we have 3 simple rules. 1, specify the amount of the shift you want in aggregate demand. 2, select a policy tool needed to induce that demand, a tax cut or spending increase. Actually, there are 2 steps, not 3. So here we have desired fiscal stimulus. You specify the amount, right? And determine what policy option to do. Do you want to increase government spending, or do you want to cut taxes? And fiscal restraint operates along the same guidelines. Which option do you want? Increase taxes or reduce government spending? Now, what are some of the things you need to watch out for when it comes to, let's say, stimulating the economy? One is called crowding out. Now, crowding out is some of the intended fiscal stimulus may be offset by crowding out of private investment. What do I mean by private investment? Think about businesses borrowing money to, expand their business. The reason why government spending could crowd out private investment, it's because the government can borrow so much money that there's less loanable funds out there for the private sector. I mean, a good example would be 2 pigs. Here's a big pig and a small pig. Now, here is a trough where the pigs are eating. Now, the big pig eats first because he's a bigger pig. What's ever left, the small pig gets. Well, this is a good example of the government and the private sector. The reason why the government is the big pig is because the government will borrow money regardless of the interest rate. So if interest rates are high, the government will still borrow money. Now, the private sector, they're very interest rate sensitive. If interest rates go up, they will borrow less. Now, if the big pig borrows so much money that there's think about this trough as a container of loanable funds. If the big pig borrows so much money, there's less loanable funds in the trough. Less loanable funds means they're more scarce. When it's more scarce, interest rates go up, and that means private sector borrows less. And that's what they mean by crowding out. So that is something to worry about, but that's usually what we call a long-run concern, not necessarily a short-run concern. Okay? Well, that closes our talk about fiscal policy. Later on in the class, we're going to talk about another way of creating more demand using monetary policy.